turn to our panelists. First, we have Florian Tietze, who is a policy advisor for international biodiversity policy at the World Wildlife Fund. Lucas Rutinger is the senior advisor at Adelphi, a leading Berlin-based think tank on environment and conflict. And Alice Ruweza is the Africa Region Director for WWF. I want to turn first to Florian to give us a background on this report. Why study the nature of conflict? Why this report, and why now?
Thank you, Megan. Also from my side, welcome to all the participants, and thank you for joining. I'm very thrilled to launch this report together with our colleagues at Adelphi. And yeah, thank you, Megan. I think it makes sense to provide a little background why we think this is so important and why we've invested the time in preparing this. We think it's crucial that the connection between the environment and environmental degradation and biodiversity loss specifically and peace and security is better understood and acknowledged in the political space of the United Nations as a structural issue. And I'm emphasizing the structural issue, and that's why we call it the nature security nexus, as you will find in our report. Because biodiversity loss and climate change are critical risks for all aspects of human societies, from livelihoods, health, food, water, even energy security, to peace and conflict. And therefore, environmental degradation and biodiversity loss are also, similar to climate change, important drivers of insecurity and conflict. And we've seen environmental issues in the security space and the political space internationally for quite some time, actually, including in the United Nations Security Council. And that includes issues such as illegal wildlife trade or illegal exploitation of natural resources, only to name a few. But it's always been sort of in bits and pieces, very case specific in the context of a very specific peace and security challenge, but never really as a structural issue that is the combination of environmental factors and how they interact with stability, peace and security, and climate change. So with that being said, we've also, of course, followed closely the developments around climate and security, including in the UN Security Council, but also in the entire UN system. And I myself, as a German citizen, have been very happy to see Germany's efforts during their last presidency of the Council to firmly place it on the agenda, and as other presidents have done since. However, we've always felt that there was sort of this important piece of the puzzle missing in the current debate, and that is the environment and security debate, and that missing piece is nature. And when I say nature, I mean biodiversity, ecosystems, and natural resources. All of these are vital for thriving human societies and for stability, peace, and security, as I've said before. And on that note, biodiversity is rapidly declining. We are in a crisis similar to the climate crisis, and scientists are warning us that the current rates of species loss is over 100, some say even 1,000 times higher than the normal rates. And in the course of the next decades, we could already lose over 1 million species. And since 1970s, we've already lost 68% of species populations of mammals, fish, birds, amphibians, and reptiles. And to add to that, biodiversity loss and climate change also are interacting. It's a twin crisis. So we can only solve one with solving the other. And then with both interacting with peace and security, that's really where the challenge gets complex. And as a last note, in this introductory remarks, I really want to add as well that we don't want climate insecurity and nature insecurity to be competing as political issues. Quite the opposite. They need to complement and build upon each other to form a comprehensive picture of how the environment and peace and security are interacting. And we need a comprehensive environmental security agenda. And that's why we made recommendations in the report to the various UN agencies, including the UN Security Council, to take first steps into that direction. I'll stop here. Thank you, Megan. Megan, you're muted still.
Sorry. Thank you so much for that introduction on the background of why this report and why now. So Lucas, tell us a little bit about the risks that you identified and the pathways that link biodiversity and and security.
Yeah, thank you, Megan. Yeah, as Florian said, in our report, we took a really comprehensive and close look at the full nature, what we call the nature security nexus. And we structured this nature security nexus into 4 different pathways that spell out the different ways in which environmental degradation and biodiversity loss interact with conflict, insecurity, and peace. And the first of these pathways is describing the link between biodiversity loss and livelihood insecurity. So environmental degradation and biodiversity loss can, of course, directly lead to increasing livelihood insecurity, especially for those who directly rely on nature and its resources and ecosystem services for their livelihoods. And within this pathway, food, water, and energy insecurity play a particular role, as they can then contribute to political instability. They can aggravate political tension, and in the worst case also push governments and whole states towards more instability and kind of overwhelm them. And for example, we could see that in terms of food security, the last time in 2008 and 2009 and 2010 and 2011, when we had very, very high global food prices, and that contributed to political instability in a number of countries around the world that are particularly reliant on food imports. Another kind of connection within this livelihood pathway is that as livelihood insecurity increases, population groups also become more vulnerable to taking part in illegal and criminal activities, and they can also be more vulnerable to be recruited into armed and terrorist groups. And then lastly, environmental degradation and livelihood insecurity can also act as a push factor for migration, which then, if not managed well, can also lead to increasing pressure, tensions, and also conflicts in receiving communities. So that's the first pathway around livelihoods. The second one is around the role of natural resources and environmental crime in financing and driving conflict. So transnational environmental crime generates, there are different estimates, but the estimates vary quite a bit, but generate around 110 to 281 billion US dollars annually, and that constitutes almost 38% of the financing for illegal non-state armed groups, including terrorist groups. It actually represents the largest source of income. So environmental crimes provide kind of important financial incentives for these groups to keep conflicts and instability and violence going. And of course, at the same time, these environmental crimes can also often lead to widespread environmental destruction. And that's particularly the case for illegal mining that we're seeing around the world on different resources, from gold to coal, the illegal exportation and trade also of oil, so fossil fuels, illegal drug production that we can see especially in Latin America, and it's linked to deforestation, illegal wildlife trade and poaching, and then of course also illegal timber trade. So that's the second pathway around natural resources and environmental crime and how that links to the financing and the ongoing of conflicts. The third pathway is conflicts around natural resources, such as land, forest, and water. So again, biodiversity loss and environmental degradation can, together also with other factors such as climate change, have severe impacts on the availability and access to natural resources. And that can increase the competition over those natural resources, and that competition can turn into conflicts and can escalate into violence, especially in areas where we've already experienced violent conflicts, or where certain groups are excluded from natural resources, where they're excluded from access to land and water. Most of these conflicts are on a local level, but they can also escalate and play a significant role in larger scale conflicts such as civil wars. And then there's also the issue of where we have transboundary natural resources, such as transboundary rivers, that are also under pressure, which can also increase tensions between states. And then the last pathway is a very direct one. It's the direct impacts of war and conflict on the environment. So wars and conflict can directly lead to environmental destruction. For example, the bombing of infrastructure, of industrial sites can lead to pollution. Of course, militaries itself are a source of environmental impacts through, for example, their emissions and the infrastructure they rely on, the supply chains they rely on. So here again, some experts estimate that the world's armed forces, so all militaries combined and the related industries are responsible for approximately 6% of total greenhouse gas emissions globally. And then what we're also seeing is that natural resources, especially water, are increasingly used as weapons of war by military and non-state actors. So for example, ISIS used its control of the Euphrates River and the Tapka Dam in 2014 to intentionally flood areas to harm enemies and expand territorial control. And then lastly, wars and conflict also feed into the other pathways. For example, environmental crime increase in the context of conflicts. And that brings me to the last point, which is important when we want to understand these risks. So we structured the nature security nexus into these 4 pathways, but of course, they're all interacting and they're also enforcing each other. So environmental destruction contributes to more conflict and insecurity, and more conflict and insecurity contributes to more environmental destruction. Back over to you, Megan.
Thank you so much, Lucas, for outlining those pathways for us. Alice, I wanted to ask you how you see these pathways operating in WWF's work. What has your experience been, particularly in Africa? What are some of the challenges you've seen around this connection?
Thank you very much, and thank you, Lucas and Florian. I think they've covered a lot of this, and I'll talk a lot about the African continent, where I see these playing strongly. First and foremost, about 30% of countries in Africa are affected by conflict. And this is estimated to result in at least 2.5% lower annual growth relative to a non-conflict scenario. And cumulatively, Africa is losing at least 15% of its GDP every year because of conflict. And in general, this is generally linked to 2 big things. One, of course, is the lack of socioeconomic opportunities. Lucas talked about that. In many places where people lack opportunities, their stake in a peaceful society is diminished. Up to 85% of recruits that are going into terrorist organizations are children that just finished secondary school but are not finding income and employment opportunities. And Africa, with the youngest population, is really at risk. I think Lucas also talked about the conflict depleting precious natural resources that we could be using as a continent to provide these socioeconomic priorities. And this constant conflict poses a security and safety threat especially for indigenous people and local communities who have lived near these natural resources for centuries and depend on them fully for their livelihood. Now, when you look at the issue of economic opportunities and you look at environmental crime, you see that Africa loses about 88.6 billion, 3.7% of its GDP annually due to illicit financial flows, whether it's illegal mining, illegal logging, and others. And if we were to tackle this, it would enable us to provide the citizens with basic social services, such as adequate water and sanitation, and this would reduce conflict and also have the financing gap that we are facing right now to deal with our sustainable development goals. So, and this, of course, plays out very much, as Lucas has said, in fragile states, because that is where you have the issues to do with weak governance, where local and national institutions lack the capacity to resolve the disputes around degradation of resources, where there are unequal power relationships and lack of transparency. The rights of indigenous peoples and local communities and women are often not recognized. Strong legislation is undermined by corruption and weak enforcement, and decisions are being made without consultation or serving a very narrow set of interests, which all lead to conflict. So weak governance, lack of economic opportunity, all those are big causes of this conflict. For WWF, it is important, and a top priority for us really is supporting indigenous peoples and local communities to protect their lands and their biodiversity from destructive activities such as logging, mining, agriculture, and infrastructure, because we know that these pressures when cause nature degradation, and when nature suffers, people also suffer. And of course, many indigenous peoples and communities have looked after these for generations, and they are usually best placed to steward the environment. I'll quickly talk about the Congo Basin as an example, if I have time, Megan. The Congo Basin is very important. Everybody knows this. It provides food, medicine, and water for over 75 million people. And in that basin, there are 150 indigenous groups who possess incredible knowledge of the forest. But the Congo Basin is important for the world because it is the second largest carbon sink. It's an important solution for addressing climate change. It is a source of minerals that are integral parts of the electronics we use today. But armed conflict has caused many challenges there: humanitarian assistance, displacement, and others. And these refugees are forced to live off the land with severe impacts to forests and wildlife. And so we know that the demand for fuel wood has led to deforestation, and the international demand for ivory is still driving the killing of elephants and all of that. And all of this are about weak governance. So really the need to address the issue of weak governance and also address the economic opportunity for these people is extremely important. And that's why for WWF, a priority is really supporting the people, supporting the indigenous communities to protect their lands, but also supporting governments to put in place more robust governance mechanisms. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Alice, for sharing your experience with WWF and as well as what's happening in the Congo Basin. I want to turn to discussing some of the recommendations in the report. Before that, a reminder to put your questions in the Q&A, as well as a reminder, of course, that we are recording this session, so your name and question will appear in that recording. So Lucas, let me start with you. What were the recommendations in the report specifically for the United Nations and its agencies?
Yeah, maybe before I start, I think it's important to kind of to understand kind of the vicious circle that we're seeing, so that we have a deepening environmental crisis connected to kind of increasing conflicts, and really together these two strands of challenges really threaten the very basis of our civilization, of human civilization. It threatens our well-being, our livelihoods, and peace. So it's very, very important to address these existential risks and break this vicious circle. And I start off a bit more broadly before I go into detail what that means for the UN, because as we are moving into a world where geopolitical tensions are increasing and conventional war, unfortunately, is once more at the forefront of attention, we should really not forget the progress that has been made in the past 20, 30 years on broadening our understanding of security. And it's also very clear that militarized approaches are not the answer to the challenges that the nature security nexus poses. So militarized approaches will fail to address the root causes of environmental degradation, conflict, and insecurity. And what the current decade of increasing conflicts and crises around the world has underlined is really the urgent need for more preventative action and more resilience. And part of this broader move towards preventive action and resilience needs to be the engagement of all security, environment, and development actors as part of a comprehensive environmental and security agenda. And that's specifically our main ask with this report, for really this comprehensive environmental security agenda. And the aim of the concerted efforts of all these actors should not be on reducing the symptoms of the environment and conflict threat, but really tackling the root causes. So environmental action can and has to play its role in preventing conflict and building peace, just as conflict prevention and peace building have to, where and when possible, contribute to environmental action. And those are really the two main recommendations that come out of that. First is that environment and climate measures and policies have to be conflict sensitive and actively address environmental related security risks, for example, by establishing inclusive natural resource management institutions that bring conflicting parties together. And the second one is that peace building, humanitarian, and stabilization actions must understand the environmental and climate risks in order to avoid harm, so that they don't make things worse on the environmental side. And this, for example, includes reflecting on the role of natural resources and environment in peace agreements and strategies, and also, but going beyond just having this understanding, where possible, peace building and stabilization programming should also actively address environment-related security risks. So now looking more specifically at the UN, what we're seeing is that responsibilities to address the nature security nexus are really dispersed across the UN system. So there are many UN organizations, institutions, and agencies that have specific roles to play and are already working on different parts of the problem. But it's really not gained the importance that it should have. So the scale of the environmental crisis and its kind of critical importance in driving insecurity make it imperative that the UN system recognize and acts more comprehensively, as Florian put so well, at this kind of structural and overarching challenge. And I don't want to take too much time up, but I'll give some examples because we covered the whole range of UN organization institutions. I'll just pick a couple of examples. So maybe starting with the UN Security Council, of course, that has an important role to play. It's important, especially important to expand the action on climate-related security risks that has been gaining attention to really address the full breadth of links between environment, conflict, and peace. As Florian also said, we do see a link between the climate security agenda and the broader environmental security agenda, and we really need to link that, especially as part of the UN Security Council. The UN General Assembly on their side can make sure that institutional capacities are increased across the UN system. They can make sure that there's enough funding available for more comprehensively addressing the climate security, the nature security nexus. And then in terms of kind of more specialized organizations, of course, the UN Environment Programme has a long track record on working on the links between environment and conflict. They have really a lot of expertise on environmental peace building, on doing post-conflict environmental assessments, and they can provide this kind of expertise to the rest of the UN system. And then the UN Development Programme, of course, is a very important lever within the system as the most important development organization. It can really ensure that integrated environment and peace building programming is upscaled and widely implemented. And then we have a whole bunch of more specific recommendations for specialized organizations such as IOM, UNHCR, the World Food Programme, IFAD, FAO, and they all have specific role to play, but maybe we can pick that up in the questions if they come up. So back to you, Megan.
Thank you, Lucas, for that look at the comprehensive approach that's needed. Florian, turning to you and thinking specifically about biodiversity and human rights and the intersection there, what are the recommendations coming out of the report that that you see as most important for those issues, particularly indigenous rights in the context of this linkage?
Thank you, Megan. Well, to answer that question, I also want to go a bit broader, because one thing that I think needs to be clear in climate insecurity as in nature insecurity is that, as Lucas has said, there is a challenge to address the interlinkages between these environmental issues and peace and conflict, but also at the same time, we urgently need to address the root causes that are the result behind the rapid degradation of biodiversity and the rapid advance of the climate crisis. And we have UN fora and institutions to do so. And currently in the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, we have really landmark negotiations going on the way to a post-2020 global biodiversity framework, so new goals and targets to address the global biodiversity crisis. And in that, there's also a reflection that we see very important that also applies here, and that's the whole of society approach. So this cannot be, sort of a political bubble that makes decisions and then it's up to the political will of environment ministers. It's really whole of government, it's whole of societies, everyone has a role to play, and the political priority needs to be heightened, is very important. And with that being said, included in that is, of course, as I think your question gears towards the human rights aspect, which is very relevant for stability, peace, conflict, but also environmental issues. So we think as part of the CBD negotiations, for example, we call it a rights-based approach. So we need these things to be closely connected to all political decisions that are made in the environment, peace, and that are made in the peace and security field. Because human rights and a healthy environment are mutually dependent. We were talking a lot about mutually related things, but it's really true in that case specifically, because To have a safe, clean, and healthy and sustainable environment, we also must protect, respect, and fulfill human rights. And to realize our human rights, we must protect and sustainably live on our planet. And the current crisis of biodiversity loss undermines also the progress, let's not forget, on the Sustainable Development Goals, the Agenda 2030, including by impacting directly the right to food, water, health, and the ability of many communities, especially those that are relying most directly on nature, to sustain their livelihoods. And that is really an interlinked challenge here. So to quickly go back to what we think also needs to be included in the current biodiversity negotiations, the rights-based approach, as I called it, there needs to be the right to a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, as it's been recognized by the Human Rights Council last year, to be included. We need, of course, and as Alice has made very clear, the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities recognized, but also intergenerational equity and gender equality, the full and effective participation of IPLCs, women, girls, and youth. And of course, very importantly, we need to support and protect environmental human rights defenders.
Thank you, Florian. That's very helpful look at the recommendations on human rights. And I wanted to turn to Alice now and to ask specifically, as WWF looks at implementing these recommendations, you know, what are your priorities? What and what kind of support is needed, you know, to enable moving forward with these recommendations?
Thank you very much, and thank you, Lucas and Florian, for sharing those recommendations. I started earlier by talking about how our top priority is very much about supporting indigenous people and local communities to protect their lands and biodiversity from destructive activities. So for us, inclusive conservation, putting people at the center of conservation, is an important part of the way that we take this forward. I mean, we know that conflict and destruction of natural resources puts the culture, indigenous culture and traditions, under threat. And their conservation depends on the recognition of these people's local communities and their as rightful custodians. And we still have much to learn from the unique knowledge, skills, and values of the indigenous people. So it's extremely important for us to really support them. And many indigenous peoples, the good news is that they are campaigning to regain control of their ancestral lands and manage them effectively and successfully. We have seen many good examples in Africa, Cameroon, Uganda, Zimbabwe, Zambia, where the communities have come and have really lobbied and been able to stop mining in the national parks or mining in their own ancestral lands. So we've had already some very good examples, and we will continue to support that. We also actively support many indigenous organizations and multi-stakeholder platforms, especially in the Congo Basin, where we really need to put in place these multi-stakeholder platforms. I think one of the points they make here is this holistic approach. We as WWF cannot do this on our own. Some of these issues, we need partners. We need government, we need partners to work with. And therefore, really, these multi-stakeholder platforms that we support in many countries allow us to bring more partners to support this work. We also have a lot of work around tackling corruption. This is a very important one. I talked about that earlier, the illicit financial flows. We are working in partnership with organizations like Traffic around targeting natural resource corruption, finding new ways, particularly harnessing knowledge, delivering thought leadership, increasing the use of data, better monitoring and risk assessment to improve intelligence sharing between national and international enforcement and intelligence agencies. And we encourage citizens especially to speak up when they see corruption and they see this mishandling. And really, the supporting of the governments and partners to put in place more ambitious governance. I talked about that. This really means working at different levels, whether it's at global policy agreement, whether it's at public and private, financial investment and market standards. Everywhere, we work at all levels to make sure that we put in place these robust governance. And I think finance is another important one that has to come to play here. We know that environment and natural resource management has been serially underfunded in many places. But when you bring such a holistic approach, when you start to recognize that these things, whether it is that the risk, the nature loss is actually a risk to security and is a risk to development, then we can bring more people from the development side, more people from the security side, more people from the environment side, and we can all work together to address this issue. Over.
Thank you so much, Alice, and especially for underlining the importance of financial support and funding for this work, which, as you said, has been overlooked. Well, we have a good amount of time for your questions, which is fantastic, and we've got some good questions. But please add yours, and once again, a reminder, of course, that this is being recorded. I wanted to pick up. There's a quick clarifying question from Doug Weir about the recommendations that maybe Lucas or Florian can answer. Is there a reason why the recommendations focus on mainstreaming nature into security for and not the other way around? I thought I heard, that you were sort of recommending both, but maybe you could clarify this.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Yeah, we not only focus on security fora, so that's one, especially the Security Council will also cover the Peace Building Fund and the Peace Building Commission as kind of the peace building, two of the peace building instruments within the UN system, but then we cover a whole range of other topic areas. So we cover food with all the Rome-based institutions, so where we can make specific recommendations on what can be done around food security. We cover migration and displacement with like targeting IOM and UNHCR, and then also development more broadly, especially UNDP and environment as well. What we don't, but it's not comprehensive. So this is kind of just a starting point where we point out entry points across the UN system. We didn't look at all the whole system. We picked out institutions, and we didn't also look at all the policy processes. So Florian already kind of elaborated a bit on the CBD. So that's not as strongly the focus of this report. It was more kind of the UN organizations on that level and not so much on the policy level. But that's definitely something that we'll want to explore in the next step, going already a bit beyond that. But yeah, maybe Florian wants to add to that.
Yes, gladly, and thanks, Lucas. I couldn't have said it any different. It's a matter of a choice where to focus on the report, and also a matter of scope, of course. That's not to say, though, that Doug's question isn't a very good one, and that he added, for example, promoting implementation support for the post-2020 agenda in fragile and conflict-affected states. I think that's very important. I've been speaking a bit about the CBD, and it's worth mentioning that even in the past, we often had pretty good global agreements, even on biodiversity. It's been the implementation that's been lacking, and the biodiversity hotspots, where the richest of our biodiversity areas are, is in the global south, and in many areas where conflict is a challenge. So implementation, especially in these areas, will be crucial, and it will require a specific tailored support, because we also need more global solidarity, to really globally tackle this global crisis, including in those countries. Financing will be very important, but not only. There needs to be more capacity, sharing of best practices and technological cooperation, all these things that to provide the whole range of resources and cooperation that's required to implement these new targets that we're going to hopefully have soon.
Great, thank you both. And something of a related question, what about militarized approaches to conservation? I know, Lucas, you touched on that a little bit, but specifically looking at conservation organizations like WWF.
Is a question for me, or I mean,
yeah, maybe you could start by talking about the report's perspective on that.
I think that, so I mean, we clearly have a lot of examples in the report where we show that militarized approaches to conservation have the opposite effect. So, for example, we have examples from Mali, where the Forest Service for a long time was very aggressive in kind of implementing their strategies, also supported by international aid, for example. But that really drove local dynamics and grievances. So what it did is that the Forest Service was increasingly seen as an actor that was kind of hindering livelihoods, local livelihoods, excluding people from forest resources. And what we could see is that really drove grievances, and that was then picked up by non-state armed groups that specifically spoke to those grievances. And for example, when they started controlling areas, allowed more inclusive access to forest resources. So we can see that where those militarized approaches are implemented, that it can actually drive those conflicts, and that they are seldom a solution. For example, as well on kind of illegal drug production in Colombia, the fumigation of coca plants is also a very militarized approach to illegal drug production, which had very harmful effects on the environment as well as on local communities. So these kind of militarized approaches by themselves are seldom a solution. They can be part of a broader solution if they're done in a very conflict and livelihood sensitive way, especially if you think about environmental crime. Of course, maybe not the military so much, but at least police forces should normally be involved in those things. But we're really cautious about this in the report in terms of our recommendations, is not to interpret the link between biodiversity loss, environmental degradation, and conflict and security on the other side, that the solution to those problems then lie in the security sphere. It's very much the opposite, that to address these kind of problems, we need to really involve a broad spectrum of actors, conservation organizations like the WWF, development actors, and then also in a more limited role, security actors, where that is really, really necessary.
Great. And then WWF's perspective on this question. Alice, would you like to take that?
Sure. It's very complex, isn't it? Because when you look at cases where you have armed militia in trying to mine in protected areas, this becomes a national security issue. And therefore you'll hear the government saying we need to bring our military in to protect the park because this is a national security issue. But as Lucas has said, when you bring the military in to protect the park, what does that mean? Because you may have some unintended consequences, such as forceful use of force to send away communities. Communities then are not accessing the park. So I think how you balance those issues is extremely important. And when this is happening in places that are fragile, that already have weak governance, then you face a perfect storm. So I think my view would be that there needs to be a balanced way to do this. There needs to be better governance for sure, training of these military forces on these issues, on human rights issues. There needs to be a collaboration on working together, making sure that the access to these resources by the local communities and indigenous peoples is maintained and is protected, while you're also protecting security. And really, so I think working with governments, continuously advocating, providing the capacity that is needed for them to put in place robust mechanisms would be the way that I would look at that.
Thank you guys for that. Question from Rod Schoonover. How do you gauge the role of corruption in ecological crime? Is it a central security concern or secondary to other issues like climate finance or organized crime?
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about that. So I think I wouldn't separate corruption out from environmental crime. It is a really important enabling factor. So normally there is kind of a strong interaction between environmental crime and weak governance. So environmental crime on the one hand kind of flourishes more in context of weak governance, but at the same time, environmental crime also actively undermines local governance by trying to corrupt officials and providing often substantive financial incentives for people who often don't earn a lot of money and might work in very remote areas. So we have this kind of strong interaction between the two. So it's a very important enabling factor for environmental crime, but also not just for environmental crime. So weak governance and corruption plays a role in almost all of the pathways that we described in the report. For example, I was talking about natural resource conflict, so it often plays the role there as well, that certain groups are excluded, as I was talking about, from access to forests, to land and water. Often corruption and weak governance also plays a role in that, also in food and water security and livelihood security more broadly. So I think if you think about how do environmental risks translate into conflict risks, into political instability, weak governance and corruption are often a very important factor. And that means on the solution side, of course, that working on governance and corruption can be extremely helpful to address the environmental security nexus.
Yeah, and I can add to that. I think I mentioned earlier, remember how much I said, I think Africa loses, I said 88.6 billion, 3.7% of its GDP to illicit financial flows. And when you look, when I say that in many of those places where we have conflict, it's places where people don't see any opportunities. They don't see any economic opportunities for them. They rise up in arms, they join terrorist groups. So tackling that and the loss of those resources would enable us to provide citizens with more basic social services. So it plays a very strong role, because in many ways there are those resources that could be used to improve governance and improve development in countries are actually going away. And so I think tackling it becomes a very big issue.
Yes, a very, very big and challenging connection, of course, but an important one to understand and highlight. So thanks for the question, Rod. Two related questions from Sagal Abshir about other linkages to other crises or challenges. First, how, given we're in the middle, I think, still of an ongoing pandemic, did the report consider at all connections between environment, security, and health? And then a related one is looking at the food issues. And I know that, Lucas, you did talk about the role of food insecurity. How about looking specifically at agriculture and how that might be linked to the broader security issues? So 2 questions, health, food, and their role in this nexus.
Okay. Yeah, maybe I'll start out with a health one. We did look at that in the report. So first of all, we looked at COVID specifically and zoonotic diseases more broadly. And I think there is a link in terms of that ecosystem loss and environmental degradation are often important in increasing the risks of contact between humans and animals, and that increases the risks of zoonotic diseases. So I think there's a lot of studies that show in, for example, for Latin America, that deforestation is really driving the increase in zoonotic diseases there. So that's one link that we have between kind of environment and health. But then also we can see that kind of within our pathways, of course, food and water insecurity often have very important health impacts, so poor nutrition and the health impacts of that, as well as kind of like water insecurity. So if people have to rely on unsafe water resources for their daily needs, that is also often very important health issue. And then on environmental crime specifically, connected, especially, for example, small-scale mining, small-scale gold mining, for example, and the use of hazardous chemicals within that process often have tremendous impacts on the environment, but then also on local populations because they rely on food sources that might be polluted, fish that has ingested those chemicals, or then water sources that have been polluted. And then maybe I'll have Florian talk a bit about the links between biodiversity and agriculture, and I can maybe pick it up on kind of more the security link again.
Thanks, Lucas. Yeah, and let me add one point on the health dynamic as well, because again, widening the focus a bit, also the impact of biodiversity loss on our ability to address health issues. To throw a couple of stats out there, 4 billion people around the world rely primarily on natural medicines for their healthcare. without biodiversity, that's no longer possible. 70% of drugs used for cancer or cancer treatment come from natural or are now synthetic, based on natural products inspired by nature. So we're not only losing our ability to address current health issues that are then having widespread effects, we're also, with losing biodiversity, even undermining our ability to address future health concerns by, losing the genetic biodiversity that we don't even have discovered yet. And then to go to the second question, the relation between biodiversity and food security is also a very direct one. Again, a simple stat that 75% of global food crops, and that includes fruits, vegetables, but also many cash crops, right, where a lot of revenue is gained from, such as coffee, cocoa, almonds, they rely on animal pollination. So insects and, without those, the production of those crops would be severely impacted or even no longer be possible. And of course, that has impacts on food security. And maybe Lucas can talk a bit more about, the direct conflict link about that and what we're seeing currently also as a result of crises that we're having in the world.
So, I think what we've also been seeing, so when I was talking before a bit about food security, I mentioned kind of the high food prices in 2008, 2009, and 2010, 2011. And those were partly driven by extreme weather events around the world in many food producing countries. So we had droughts that were happening, that were impacting wheat production in Russia, in Australia, in the US. So different parts of the world concurrently hit by weather-related disasters, especially drought. And that really drove up global food prices. And there what we could see is countries that rely on those imports and then also often provide subsidies for certain food, staple foods, for example, bread. They were not able to sustain this kind of support, and food prices jumped very rapidly within different countries. And in those countries, we could see that that often, especially if we had politically already unstable situations, was acting as a catalyst for protests. So that really drove people into the streets. And we could see that especially in 2010-11, also across the MENA region, often part also of the Arab Spring in Egypt. It was really one of the things that high bread prices were one of the things that drove people to the streets. Of course, it wasn't the only thing. There was political instability before and other grievances, but it acted as a catalyst for a lot of the protests. And now this year, we can see another impact. We can see the war in Ukraine and how that is impacting global food production, with Russia being impacted as an exporter, as well as Ukraine. And we can see a lot of countries, especially on the African continent, that are very, very concerned at the moment what these higher food prices will mean, and if we are in for another round of political instability in countries that will not be able to provide food at sustainable prices for their population.
Thank you. And Alice, I wanted to ask if you had some perspectives on these connections with health and or food from your experience with WWF in Africa.
Yes, I think both Lucas and Florian have covered it. But when you look at the health, if you start to look at the many theories that have been put forward on the cause of on the rise on why we got the pandemic in the first place, some of them have advanced the fact that the illegal wildlife trade. The illegal wildlife trade in pangolins and the wet market, basically those go into the wet market and then people access. So that in many ways then links environmental crime to a health pandemic, which is extremely important. But also I think and I talked earlier about the governance. I think obviously having processes in country to regulate these markets, to have phytosanitary standards that look at this before they get exported, for example, are also important and are very much linked to governance. On food, I think Lucas has already said, I think it's over 35 countries that are depending on wheat from Ukraine. And I think maybe 10 or 12, it's even over 50% of that. So we are already seeing a lot of impacts here. The rise in prices is there. We are seeing the rise in food prices there, and we don't know, when this is going to end, and we really have to look at bold, come up with bold solutions to deal with those issues. I mean, some people have talked about, we have our new Africa Free Trade Area, which will enable us to trade much more amongst each other. And I think there's a lot of thinking now to really work on making us more self-sustaining as a continent and less dependent on importing food from abroad. But that obviously means working on our food systems and really dealing with a lot of the issues in our food systems to make ourselves more self-sustainable. So, yeah.
Thank you. I want to jump to a question from Miko Hallinan, because it's one that I certainly struggled with in my time in environmental security, and it's about framing. And because as Lucas and Florian and Alice have all outlined, these are part of a comprehensive approach, and so. But we live in a sectoral world that likes to slice things up into buckets. So when does it make sense to explicitly speak about the security perspective of sustainable development and conservation, as opposed to the frame of equitable, sustainable livelihoods and development? And similarly, the trade-off between speaking about economic costs and benefits versus equitable and sustainable management of natural resources. So again, when you're talking to trying to develop a comprehensive approach that engages all of these different communities, how do you choose, when to frame the arguments?
I mean, it's a very good question, because I think that is really often at the heart of kind of when you talk to different actors, of kind of convincing them that this is an issue, is kind of this framing issue. So how do you slice it up to talk to different actors, and when and where and how to talk about like the security implications is really key, because you can like really push people away of course also with a too strong security framing, especially my experience is, for example, on the African continent, that it's like it's often much more palatable to talk about development than instead of talking about conflict and fragility as too central of a topic. So I think we need to be really sensitive and understand who we are talking to and frame it accordingly. I think it is in general a good way of elevating environmental issues to a different level, and I think that's part of why we make this argument, is to show that this is not a niche issue. It's at the heart of our well-being. It's about our peace and security and about our livelihoods. So I think that is a very important argument to make, to convince organizations and donors that this is really at the heart of what they should be working on and what they should be funding. On the other hand, to not overstretch that argument and maybe push people away by framing it too strongly in a security framing, and then and not talking about that it's also about livelihoods, that it is about development and all of these other things. So I think that is just as important as it is for the WWF, for example, to talk about conservation and livelihoods as well, that we cannot only talk about livelihoods anymore. We have to really broaden these and bring these together. And that's kind of what we're trying to do, is kind of, where do we have overlaps? Where do we have synergies between these different issues? And where are entry points for organizations to work on these issues together? So I think that's a very short answer to a very big question. Back over to you.
And maybe I can add, Megan, very quickly, just because I think that's a very important disclaimer, and Lucas responded very well to a complex question. What we're certainly not trying to do here is securitizing the environment agenda, right? That's completely, that would be the wrong message. We're trying to show, and that's really a first step with this report, that it really is a structural factor in this area. It matters, and it needs to be treated as such. And there, with a nexus that overlaps in very different political spheres, it becomes challenging, because then these, often political bubbles that we're having, not only in the UN systems, but also national and regional governments, they need to talk to each other on these issues. They need to understand them. And this brings the discussion forward and helps us to decide, for example, in a case specific situation, where are the challenges, what do we need to address, and where especially do we have to link solutions, and also, which I think hasn't been said yet, to avoid unintended circumstances that often arise if we look at the issue in a sort of silo approach.
Yeah, and I would just add by saying that, yeah, we definitely need a whole of government approach. And I think even when I look at nature conservation, it's not just for conservation organizations. It's everyone's business. It's everyone's business, and just as and so is economic development. And ultimately, everything we do is about people, right? We really are trying to save ourselves. We're trying to save humanity, and that is an important way. And for that, we need a whole of society approach.
Yeah, as one of my mentors often said, people live holistic lives. They don't live in sectoral buckets, and our work has to recognize that too. We're almost at time here, and I wanted to throw in one last question on a more hopeful, on a hopeful note, about the security benefits and peace benefits. In particular, I think of transboundary cooperation. Can you tell us a little bit about the report's approach to environmental peace building through biodiversity across boundaries? And please consider this as well your opportunity for any final closing remarks.
Great. Maybe I'll start from the report's perspective. So one thing is important, that these risks cross boundaries, so they don't really see boundaries. So most of the kind of like approaches that we need to implement should be transboundary in nature. So that's the kind of starting point. But then on the other hand, kind of more on the peace and security benefits is that, of course, environmental issues can also be a connector. So they can bring countries together. So they can be the nucleus of more cooperation. So for example, transboundary national protected areas can be something that maybe countries that are not willing to talk in other areas, maybe that is a starting point for them to start collaborating, as well as kind of transboundary approaches to disasters, be it fire management or flooding. These are very concrete issues that a lot of countries have to face, and bringing people together can really have benefits. Having said that, having worked on these issues for a long time, it is normally important to link kind of a technical approach of having kind of experts from both sides working together with a bit of a political process and political buy-in, and also diplomatic support. So we cannot just assume that cooperation on a technical level just percolates up into political cooperation between countries. So if you really want to have these impacts on a higher political level, you will also have to include foreign offices. You have to include diplomats, and have them being part of these kind of maybe more technical projects. So having different tracks to do that.
Alice or Florian, would you like to talk about any experience WWF has with this?
I can just add that I'm so glad we're having Lucas on board as our partner, because sometimes he doesn't leave anything left to say. He's so knowledgeable. But yeah, he took the words right out of my mouth, because basically to say, right, nature doesn't know any boundaries, and species don't. They travel, and that's not only the whales in the oceans, but the birds in the sky. And that sounds a bit like flowery here, but it's true. To protect that and to conserve our ecosystems, we cannot just do that in the logic of our borders that we often get too caught up in. And as Lucas has said, that can bring about positive effects in cooperation and understanding each other better, and tackling many of the challenges that we're having also in the security space.
Yeah, I mean, I will add the same and maybe just close. I think for me, there is definitely hope, and good governance is key. I mean, governments have made commitments on the environment and human rights and have passed laws to protect nature, whether nationally or transboundary. We're seeing many businesses becoming more serious about creating a better future for people. We're seeing community groups and civil society organizations successfully challenging and influencing decisions that affect them. And there are many examples of good environmental governance in practice, locally managed marine areas where fish stocks are recovering, certification schemes. And so for me, I see really economic development as key to minimizing this risk of conflict, but also governance and creating these opportunities for people will be a critical strategy. And of course, financing. And all of this will require a whole of society approach, which I think that this report talks about and really gives an opportunity for us to look at this nature, security, climate change, and nexus. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alice, for those hopeful points. And as Florian said, nature knows no boundaries, but unfortunately, our time does have a boundary, and we have reached it. Clearly, we could talk about this report and these issues for many hours more. So I encourage everyone to download the report. The link is in the chat. Please check it out. And thank you so much for all your questions. And thank you especially to all of our panelists. And thank you for joining us today. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Well,
Megan.
thanks
Thank
for
you, everyone.
hosting.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.